From the hills above, you can hear the war going on between former allies in a town that was the epitome of ethnic togetherness. Central Bosnia has been gripped by a madness apparently without end.
It's hard to imagine, in our continent and in our time, what kind of people could do this.
It's one of Bosnia's biggest tragedies that friends become enemies so easily now.
Throughout Central Bosnia, the former allies against the Serbs are tearing at each other.
Negotiators can only do so much.
UN forces will not nor cannot get involved in trying to end the fighting.
But the battle for the wider area goes on, village by village, with no mercy being shown on either side.
The word atrocity has been used a lot in this war. It's usually very difficult to find out exactly what has happened. There's so much propaganda and myth.
The tragedy is that there's nothing I can do for these people.
Those who are in the upper echelons, who are actually making the decisions and orchestrating these genocidal campaigns, must also be brought to justice.
We pass the now familiar sight of the results of this war, yet more families who've lost everything.
Probably they will say maybe it's a war crime because they are slaughtered civilians. And maybe in the future there will be an investigation of the Court of Justice in The Hague or something like that.
The investigations into crimes committed during the conflict between Bosnian Croats and Muslims in central Bosnia commenced even as crimes were still happening.
For the people of Stupni Do, the 23rd of October 1993 was hell. There is simply no other way to describe it. On that day, the village of Stupni Do became a blazing inferno of death and destruction. The sounds of gunfire and shelling of explosions were later replaced by the sounds of women and children, and indeed, I am sure, grown men crying. Unfortunately, Stupni Do was one of the signature events in the Balkan Wars, together with the Sarajevo siege, Amici, Vukovar Hospital, Mostar, and Srebrenica. Only 5 days after this massacre, only 5 days, on the 28th of October, 1993, the atrocity came before the United Nations Security Council, which demanded an investigation.
When the Office of the Prosecutor was first set up and began its operations, there was already existing a body of material about what had happened in the conflict. We did have witness statements that had been taken by other people. We had the Commission of Experts that had been set up by the Security Council. So we had a framework for looking at the conflict, trying to identify the most important areas of focus for the office. And then it was a question of assigning teams to go out and start work in the field, collecting whatever information they could find.
Mr. Leach, could you describe your duties and responsibilities since you've been here at the tribunal?
After arriving at the tribunal, my main area of responsibility has been to coordinate the investigations in relation to events in central Bosnia. That is done in conjunction with investigators, military analysts, researchers, and legal officers who give legal direction to the team. The area of central Bosnia that we've been investigating in the tribunal is generally this area here. The central point would be the town of Zenica and the surrounding municipalities.
The investigations were particularly difficult in the early stages, particularly in the 1990s, because the suspects and ultimately defendants, for the most part, if they were leadership people, were still very influential in the region. And In the case of Central Bosnia, it was still the same group of people who were in control of both sides in the late 1990s who'd been prosecuting the war at the time. So this made a lot of things difficult.
As you can imagine, the mere fact that the Security Council decided to set up a tribunal and imposed an obligation on states to cooperate with us in our work didn't then mean that all doors were open to us and we could just immediately have access to everything we needed to put our cases together. There was a lot of resistance, especially from the states of the former Yugoslavia, to facilitating our work, which meant that day to day we had a lot of difficulties accessing the documents, the crime scenes, the witnesses that we needed in order to build our case and ultimately come forward with a successful prosecution.
Despite the initial difficulties, the Office of the Prosecutor was able to issue indictments against the Bosnian Croat perpetrators as soon as November of 1995.
With respect to the investigations into Central Bosnia, we had a large number of indictments, both on the HVO and on the Bosnian-Herzegovina, Army of Bosnia-Herzegovina side. We had trials very early on in the mid-90s already. We did get some of our suspects in the building to have trials very early on.
The fact is that this international tribunal has never had and will never have the opportunity to hear cases against all the persons allegedly being among the most responsible for the events in Laffer Valley in one procedure. Chambers of this international tribunal can only hear a case regarding a person against whom an indictment has been filed and confirmed and who is present in The Hague.
So it has been a reality that many of our early cases started with lower level or mid-level perpetrators who were accessible to us. But in fact that worked to our advantage in many ways because it meant that we could spend quite a lot of time and adduce a lot of proof about the crime base, what happened, what were the crimes committed.
Richard G. Goldstone, procureur du Tribunal pénal international pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, fait valoir que, premièrement, des violations graves du droit international humanitaire ont été commises durant la période allant de mai 1992 à mai 1993, lorsque les forces armées du Conseil de défense croate, ci-après HVO, de la communauté croate de Herceg-Bosna, ci-après HZHB, ont attaqué de façon générale la population civile musulmane dans les villes, villages et hameaux de la région de la vallée de la Lasva, de la Bosnie centrale.
In April of 1996, Croatian Defense Counsel General Tihomir Blaškić became the first ever accused to surrender to the tribunal voluntarily. Before the trial even began, the tribunal's judges were faced with legal issues related to obtaining evidence from states by binding orders.
I mentioned that for many years the OTP had been seeking documents relating to the HVO military activities that it wanted to use in particular for the Blaškić case, but then also for the other related cases too. And at a certain point the trial chamber agreed with the prosecution that it should issue a binding order to Croatia to produce the documents that were in its possession. And as you can imagine, Croatia's reaction at that time was to say, what authority does an international tribunal have to issue a binding order of any kind to a sovereign state?
Pitanje da li sapina ili ne, nije samo tehničko pitanje. Pa je onda kao svejedno da li jedan nalog zovemo sapina, nalog, naredba ili nekako drugačije. To je iznimno važno pitanje međunarodnog kaznenog prava, a usudio bi se reći i općeg svjetskog poretka.
Eventually it all ended up before the appeals chamber, and after an extensive hearing the appeals chamber ruled on the issue. And importantly, it confirmed that yes, an international tribunal, and the ICTY in particular, does have power to issue binding orders to a sovereign state.
The legal framework was set up for receiving evidence in the first case related to crimes in Central Bosnia.
Je ne doute pas que de part et d'autre, sachant que l'histoire nous regarde, la postérité nous jugera, nous ayons à cœur d'assurer au général Blaskić ce procès juste, équitable et dans des délais raisonnables auxquels il a le droit et surtout auxquels l'opinion publique internationale a le droit d'avoir accès.
Soon after, Bosnian Croat political leader from Central Bosnia, Dario Kordic, became the first political figure to surrender to the tribunal. In these early trials, the judges heard the story of how the political separation between Bosnian Croats and their former allies, the Bosnian Muslims, led to crimes in Central Bosnia.
The main players are on the one side, the more radical wing of the HDZ-BIH, which had taken over control of the Croatian political authorities in Central Bosnia, and on the other side, the BIH government and the army of BIH, which by that point in Central Bosnia was mainly composed of the Muslim ethnic group.
Prvi dokumenat je u stvari odluka o uspostavljanju Hrvatske zajednice Herceg Bosne, koja je donijeta 18. novembra 1991. godine. Član prvi ove odluke govori o tome da se uspostavlja Hrvatska zajednica Herceg Bosna kao, naglašavam, politička, kulturna, ekonomska i teritorijalna cjelina. Značenje ovog prvog člana je, po mom mišljenju, u namjeri da se zaokruži dio teritorije Republike Bosne i Hercegovine u jednu cjelinu kojoj bi se dali državnotvorni elementi.
Beginning in April of 1992, the HVO had claimed most of the municipalities of Central Bosnia and set up parallel government and parallel military structures to the government's structures. And the two existed in parallel uncomfortably through 1992. There was sporadic fighting in October in particular.
The establishment of a separate Bosnian Croat entity caused tensions, which increasingly resulted in armed incidents, especially in ethnically mixed towns and villages of Central Bosnia.
Just if you can, in a sentence or so, particularize the difficulties that flowed between November of 91 and February of 92 from this creation of Herceg Bosna. Can you give any examples, please?
U tom periodu u Vitezu formira se jedna firma, Vitez Trade, uglavnom od predstavnika HDZ-a, koja izvozi iz Viteza eksploziv i barut, a koliko smo čuli i vidjeli, dovozi iz Hrvatske oružje, novac iz Hrvatske. Taj se novac dijeli hrvatskom narodu.
Prvo su vlasti Herceg Bosne formirale HVO vlast. To je bila jednonacionalna vlast. Da bi se vremenom, a tačnije u maju 1992. godine, svi muslimani istjerali iz vlasti. Mi smo u to vrijeme imali zajednički parlament, imali smo zajedničku vlast. Hrvati su bili u većini. Imali su svu vlast. A kada se zna da su imali svu vlast, postavlja se pitanje zašto su tjerali muslimane iz vlasti.
To je poslije HVO izvršio oduzimanje vlasti u opštini, u stanici policije, i tako da smo mi muslimani već mogli nazreti da se ne radi u obrani protiv JNA, nego da se radi o muslimanima, da je i nama tu sada kritično ostati. Što je koji dan, mjesec prolazio više, 92. više se uočavalo više naoružanja kod Hrvata, više uniformisanih lica sa oznakama HVO-a, s tim što je pritisak i zastrašivanje učestalo više.
Časni sude, to nije bio izuzetak. Naprotiv, bilo je dosta incidenata iz perioda naročito negdje od konca travnja mjeseca 1992. pa tijekom 5., 6., 7. i 8. mjeseca 1992. A ono što je posebno karakteriziralo te incidente, naročito u prvoj etapi, bili su to uglavnom individualni incidenti, da bi kasnije prerastali u incidente pojedinih grupa, sela, pa vremenom i u međunacionalne incidente.
And when you look back and look at the political background to all of it and see how needless it was and how avoidable it was, that makes it particularly difficult to deal with. It wasn't an act of God. It wasn't a spiral of events out of control. Individuals could have stopped it. Certain individuals were working to make it happen.
At the same time, the international community made attempts to reach a political solution for the escalating hostilities in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
The basic facts of life are that if the Croats and the Muslims can't live together side by side, then there will not be a Bosnia-Herzegovina.
This, Your Honor, was occurring in Geneva, where since September of 1992, negotiations involving the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims, under the direction of Cyrus Vance and Lord Owen, were taking place. The fruit of this effort was known as the Vance-Owen Peace Plan. Under the Vance-Owen Peace Plan, Your Honors, Bosnia and Herzegovina was to become a decentralized state. It was to be divided into 10 provinces, each of which was to be controlled by either the Serbs, the Muslims, or the Croats.
Well, the Vance-Owen plan didn't cause the war in central Bosnia, but it certainly acted as a catalyst which brought matters to the fore, leading to the outbreak of hostilities in January of 1993.
The Croats were assigned 3 provinces. Provinces 3, 8, and 10. Province number 10 included the Vitez municipality, the Busovac municipality, and part of the Kislyak municipality, where the crimes alleged in this indictment took place. When the Bosnian Croats were shown a map of this territorial division, they were elated. And on the 4th of January, 1993, Mati Boban accepted the Vance-Owen Peace Plan in full. He liked the map, the division. However, the Muslims and the Serbs did not.
That leads to the first ultimatum to have non-HVO and non-Herzegovina forces to submit themselves to the HVO in the provinces which they considered to be promised to them in the Vance-Owen plan. They back off of the first ultimatum in January. When the second ultimatum expires, which is on the 16th of April 1993, within hours of that ultimatum expiring, you have the massacre in Akhmad at 5 in the morning on that same day.
The chambers found that the Bosnian Croat troops moved to implement the proposed territorial division by force. On the 16th of April 1993, the Croatian Defense Council launched a massive attack on Muslim towns and villages throughout central Bosnia.
The initial reports came from static positions that we had and included reports, or a report from the Dutch transport squadron near Icty and our own logistic base outside Vitez. The reports centered on widespread fighting or shooting, a great deal of houses on fire up and down the Laffer Valley. And what was most puzzling of all were reports of large mortar and artillery exchanges or shootings. Between 200 and 300 artillery and mortar rounds had landed that morning in the area of Vitez and its environs.
The chambers found that the Muslim village of Akhmad suffered some of the worst atrocities in this campaign.
Kad je bilo negde oko 5 sati i 30 minuta, tad sam čuo prvo ispaljenje sa gornje strane puške. I nije prošlo malo, to je bio kao neki signal. Onda je krenulo sa te strane sve jače i jače. Meci su išli ko kad čele zuje.
What you remember of what happened on the morning of the 16th of April 1993?
Oko 5:30 probudila nas je artiljerijska paljba. Napadnuto je donje selo kraj ceste i srednje selo Grabovi. Mi smo bili u kući, ja, otac, majka, 3 sestre, a brat je bio u podrumu dole, on je dole spavao. Odmah šta sam zapazio, gorjela je kuća u Grabovima Ahmić Šukrije.
Čekali smo u sobi, spavačoj sobi do 6:10. Čulo je se hod vojnika. Na našim prozorima bile su rešetke. Prvo udar čizmama, kundacima su razbili prozor i ja sam rekao svojima da idemo, bacit će nam bombu.
Nije prošlo ni 3-4 minute poslije toga, ulazna vrata naše kuće su jednostavno bila zasuta puščanom paljbom. Mi smo se nalazili u kuhinji, tako da nije nikog tada zakačilo. Jednostavno su bila sva izrešetana puščanom paljbom. Onda poslije toga su stali lupat na vrata da je provale. Ja i otac smo izašli i dozvali, rekao nemojte lupat, otvorit ćemo. I mi smo im otvorili. Kad smo ugledali, bila su 2 vojnika. Bili su namazani raznoraznim bojama po licu.
Ja sam istrčao na verandu u sebe, pogledao, nikoga nije bilo, pogledao sam tamo komšijama, nema ih. Osjetio sam granate gore da padaju, puca se iz ne znam sve s kakvog naoružanja.
I naredi meni i ocu da prođemo sa južne strane moje kuće, a ovom je manjem naredio da pričuva majku i sestre. Kad smo došli sa donje strane kuće, ugledali smo brata Murisa ubijenog, bio je potrbuške, ležao je mrtav.
Izašli smo u kuhinju, ja sam zatvorio vrata, od sobe bomba je pukla. u sobi gdje smo bili. Ponovo sam rekao da bježimo dalje u hodnik. Mi smo u hodnik, druga je bomba pukla u kuhinji. Iz hodnika normalno morali smo izaći vanje. Majka je prva otvorila, sestra, ja, otac. Čim smo izašli pred kuću, vidio sam ispred kuće bila je ograda, iza ograde 2 leša.
Kad smo došli tu kod ubijenog mi brata, on je naredio, visoki vojnik, naredio je ocu iskorači 2 koraka. Otac je to jedva učinuo i onda mu je sa metra opalio jedan metak direktno u sljepočnicu. Otac je pao odmah na licu, mjesta je mrtav, ja mislim ostao. Zatim je meni rekao, iskoraci 2 koraka. Ja sam ga poslušao, iskoracio sam. Sa lijeve strane mi je isto meni sa metra opalio metak. Metak mi je evo ovdje ušao, a ovdje izašao. I on se okrenuo onda, u dvorište se vratio.
So, as you can imagine, this was really something shocking when the news spread to the world's media, which it did because there were international personnel present in the area who uncovered what had happened.
At some point around lunchtime, it came over my radio to go to the village of Icty, where there was reported incidents of fighting there. So I drove to Icty from Vitez with the 4 warriors. And drove down the main road. Maybe I could show you. Here. I then radioed in to my officer commanding, Major Martin Thomas, what was happening. I said there was a lot of dead people on the sides of the road, near the houses. And there, as far as I could see, although there was the occasional shot coming down from the south west, there was no resistance and nobody alive that I could see.
There was not a building that had not been destroyed. They'd been systematically destroyed. There was not the scene of battle, the likes of which we'd seen in Vitez and in my own military experience in other parts of the world. There were not rocket grenade explosions on the walls. There weren't great heaps of empty cases. There weren't dead soldiers or the signs of where dead soldiers are being, blood and so on. The thing that was quite so shocking was the village was totally destroyed, the animals were destroyed, the crop, the barns, the root cellars, everything was totally destroyed. There was just nothing for anyone to come back to that village for.
I mean, this is Europe 1993, not 1943.
In April 1993, it was the turn of Vitez and the Muslim villages of the Laffer Valley to come under attack. The trial chamber finds that the evidence points to a well-organized and planned HVO attack upon these locations. In particular, the village of Akhmad, where the attack early in the morning of 16th of April resulted in a massacre in which more than 100 people were murdered, including 32 women and 11 children, and the village was destroyed. There were similar attacks on the villages up and down the Laffer Valley and on the town of Vitez. The trial chamber finds that these attacks followed a common design or plan conceived and executed by the Bosnian Croat leadership to ethnically cleanse the Valley of Muslims.
So about a month after the Icty massacre, the UN Security Council decided to set up the ICTY as a way of responding to the many stories of atrocities coming out of the conflict. But I think it's fair to say that the events in Central Bosnia were very much part of the international consciousness when the decision was made to take this groundbreaking step of setting up an international criminal tribunal.
The massacre in Akhmad was the gravest, but not the only crime by the HVO. In October of 1993, the Croat forces murdered more than 35 people in the Muslim village of Stupni Do, near Vareš. Their commander accepted his responsibility before the tribunal.
Te žrtve su bile nepotrebne, baš kao I rat između dva prijateljska naroda. Obiteljima stradalih upućujem ispriku I svoju najiskreniju sućut za svu bol koju trpe zbog gubitka svojih najmilijih. Sve te žrtve zaslužuju istinu I pravdu.
You were ordered to go to the village of Stupni Do in the municipality of Vareš.
Yes.
Can you describe very briefly to the court what you found in that village when you arrived?
It was total destruction of the village. There were very few houses that had not been set on fire and totally destroyed. There were a number of bodies in the area, and the ones which stick in my mind are the two women which had been shot as they hid in the vegetable pit in one of the houses.
The findings of crimes were undeniable. However, attempts were made by states to withhold crucial evidence from appearing before the judges.
Another big problem we had in the 1990s was access to documentation, to good documentation. In any case that goes beyond the level of physical perpetrators and gets you into levels of leadership where your suspects aren't people who are physically at the scene of the crime, you're going to need access to the documentary records. And we had some in the 1990s, but it was still very limited. And it was very difficult to operate until about the year 2000 in terms of building a picture of what happened at a higher level through the documentary record.
And I think when it comes to Central Bosnia, this is really reflected in the OTP's efforts to obtain the military documents from the Croatian Defence Council, the HVO, which we wanted to build and reinforce our cases in relation to Central Bosnia and the crimes committed by the Bosnian Croat forces against the Bosnian Muslim forces. Initially, we started requesting these documents in about 1996, so very early on, and we were met with a litany of excuses. Either the documents hadn't been created or consolidated into an archive, they were missing, they were destroyed during the war.
For example, the trial chamber during the trial subpoenaed Bosnia-Herzegovina for the war diary of the Central Bosnian Operative Zone, HVO. The BH authorities did not produce it. Similarly, the prosecutor subpoenaed the Republic of Croatia for HVO war records. We all believed they would be very relevant. Croatia did not, in the main, produce those documents. They certainly did not produce the documents that we are now able to tender to you from the archives.
Things eventually began to change in about 2000 after there had been a regime change in Croatia, a new government. And at this time, 2 big archival collections were discovered, including the HVO military archive that we had been looking for many years. Eventually, we managed to get more full access to those documents in 2004, but by this time, of course, the Blaskic trial was already over and the case was proceeding through appeal.
This appeal has been characterized by the filing of an enormous amount of additional evidence. This was due inter alia to the lack of cooperation on the part of the Republic of Croatia at that time, and to the delay in the opening of the Republic of Croatia's archives, which only occurred following the death of former President Franjo Tuđman on 10 December 1999, thus preventing the parties to this case from availing themselves of these materials at the trial.
Based on the newly admitted evidence, the appeals chamber reduced Blaskic's sentence from 45 to 9 years in prison. However, the chambers in this and other cases found that the crimes committed by Bosnian Croats in Central Bosnia were not isolated incidents.
No, they weren't isolated incidents at all, which was something that was claimed early on, and which was something which was widely believed and something that was plausible until we'd had our investigations and our trials.
We are not going to try to excuse the terrible things that were done at places like Akhmad or Stupni Do, and we never have. And I certainly don't, well, I certainly hope that the trial chamber thinks or recalls that our position on that issue has been absolutely consistent. But I must respectfully say this, that the prosecution has theorized that it is the Bosnian Croats that were guilty of widespread and systematic persecution throughout the territory of the HZHB and in the municipality of Zenica. Bad things were going on both sides, there's no question about it, but it was not a widespread, systematic campaign of persecution.
But no, now looking back on that, we can say absolutely not. Stupni Do and Akhmad were not isolated incidents committed by wild units. It was part of a much bigger pattern and much bigger plan.
In relation to those counts alleging persecution, the trial chamber finds, on overwhelming evidence, that there was a campaign of persecution aimed at the Bosnian Muslims throughout the indictment period in Central Bosnia. It took the form of the most extreme expression of persecution, that is, attacking towns and villages with a concomitant destruction and plunder, killing, injury, and detention. The purpose of the campaign was the subjugation of the Bosnian Muslim population.
I think another interesting feature is the fact that Croatia's role in the conflict in Central Bosnia was very much an issue in many of our cases. And this might sound strange given that the tribunal is focused on dealing with individuals and not the responsibility of states, but it came up in a very important way in the Central Bosnia cases because the prosecution charged crimes which depended on the prosecution proving that the conflict was an international one.
Under the Tadic Appeals Chamber decision, as well as a more recent Alazovsky opinion of the Appeals Chamber, it is the position of those two appellate chambers that for international armed conflict to exist, there must be a showing of an overall control of the HVO by the Republic of Croatia. We believe that the prosecution has not made such a showing in this case.
So that meant that we had to bring all kinds of evidence about the role that Croatia played in the conflict so that we could prove that indeed the conflict should be characterised as international. So we led evidence in quite a lot of detail about how Croatia was funding and training and equipping and overall directing and controlling the activities of the HVO.
Javna hrvatska politika uvijek je polazila od toga da je Bosna država, da je ona cjelovita i da je Hrvatska prva priznala Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Međutim, objektivno, gledajući sve ono što se kasnije događalo, kad Milošević stvara na teritoriju Bosne i Hercegovine Srpsku republiku, Hrvati najprije Hrvatsku zajednicu Herceg-Bosnu, a kasnije Republiku Herceg-Bosnu, jasno je bilo da to nije učvršćivalo Bosnu i Hercegovinu, nego da je to razbijalo Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Znači, na jednoj strani je bilo javno manifestiranje u hrvatske odlučnosti da se zalaže za cjelovitu Bosnu, a na kraju vozili smo se na repu Miloševićeve politike, jer je upravo rađeno ono što je radio i Milošević.
These arguments by the prosecution were met with very strenuous arguments in opposition by the defence, who really sought to prove that Croatia was not involved in the Central Bosnia conflicts at all.
It will be made clear that there were not HV troops in Central Bosnia. As Major General Filipović will testify this week, he wished there had been HV soldiers in Central Bosnia because he could have used the help. They were getting the bejesus beat out of them in mid-1993 and could have used any assistance whatsoever, whether it be HV troops or not, and that simply was not the case.
But despite those very strong defence arguments, the prosecution succeeded in proving Croatia's involvement and that the conflict was international.
The trial chamber finds that there was a general state of armed conflict in central Bosnia at the relevant time. It also finds that there is a clear connection between this conflict and the alleged crime set out in the indictment. The trial chamber finds that due to the intervention of the Republic of Croatia, this conflict was international.
The first wave of cases was the series of cases involving crimes committed by Bosnian Croat perpetrators against Bosnian Muslim victims. The second wave of cases involved Bosnian Muslim perpetrators and crimes committed against Bosnian Croat and Bosnian Serb victims, the so-called flip side cases.
In 1992, a large number of foreign soldiers, the Mujahideen, who were motivated by their religious convictions, came to Bosnia to fight for the ABIH, and quite a few of them, a few hundred of them, were already in central Bosnia, particularly in the area around Travnik in late 1992. And this proved to be quite a big problem.
In June 1993, the Mujahideen executed more than 20 Croat prisoners in the village of Bikoši near Travnik.
Kad su nas postrajali gore u grupe, kad su nas odveli ispred ovog, sam rekao, kao da je bunar ispred njega na asfaltni put, on je 3 metra, kako su mi dolazili u grupama, a Mijo Tavić, on je imao padavicu, koji je bio padavicu, epilepsiju. Kako mi smo stajali gore, ja sam bio druga ili treća grupa, sam bio gore i onda njemu je došao taj tren napada i njegov. Čulo se da je on zadrećao, pošao jadikovat, on se valjda prepalo, otvorili vatru. Ovaj što je stajao ispred mene na metar i po, 2, jer asfalt je nije širi od 3 metra uopće. U pol klečeći stav sam ga vidio da je pošao da pravi, ja sam samo direktno i okrenuo se i bacio se na zemlju. I samom padu, dok sam padao, metak me je pogodio u desni lakat ruke. I s tim kad sam padao dolje, Na asfalt sam, kako mi ruka kad sam pogođen, otkazala me tu u ramenu. Onda sam pao i licem sam isto udario od asfalt i ležao na asfaltu pravi se mrtav. S tim što mi je s lijeve strane Ićan Volić, jedan visok krupan čovjek, pao mi na noge, jer sam poslije vidio kad sam se pomakao da je utroba bila raznesena, on držao je rukom i čulo se samo njegovo ono kljukanje. A s desne strane, desno nogu, kako sam pao, bio mi je Slavko Bobaš, pokušan rafalom, pao mi je dolje. I tako sam ostao pravi se mrtav.
So the investigations into crimes committed by members of the Bosnian Muslim armed forces resulted in indictments against a series of fairly high-ranking military figures from the Bosnian Muslim army, people like Rasim Delic, Enver Hadzijazanovic and Sefer Halilovic. In large part, these cases involve questions of command responsibility. So the accused were being charged with crimes that their subordinates had committed. They hadn't personally committed them. They were crimes that had been carried out by forces the prosecution said were under the accused's control.
The chambers learned that not only the Mujahideen committed crimes on the Bosnian Muslim side. In September 1993, regular forces of the army of BiH massacred more than 25 civilians in the village of Uzdol near Prozor.
Krenuo sam gore moje kući. Odmah idem gore, gorila je percana pere, zelenike i kuća i štala. I onda sam gore izišao gdje je kuća Josipa, zelenike. Zvao sam Josipa, Josip je preživio, bio to je Janin brat, ali ga nisam našao. I onda sam izišao gore, pored palke zelenika kuće, gore do moje kuće. Kad sam banuo pred svoju kuću, hodnik je otvoren. Ugledao sam moju kćerku Jadranku gdje leži na hodniku. Sobna vrata sa hodnika su otvorena. Ležao mi je otac poboren, potrbuške ispred vrata, a u sobi. A moja mama je bila na krevetu, bračni krevet. I glava je bila odbijena gore od ovo tjeme, kako bi rekao. I onako mozak je bio po zidu i gore po plafonu to. Nije imala gore i gornje dio glave nikako.
But in this case it seems clear that there was wholesale killing of civilians. But as to the reason, it's almost impossible for an observer to guess.
I can't remember the sequence, but we went into house after house. And the scene in each house was that we discovered dead people, sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes in the front room. These are small houses. On a sofa, on the floor. I went into one house and there was a body in bed. And the bedclothes were soaked through with blood. I went into another house, there was a body in the corner. There was a huge blood spray up the wall, a white wall. And all of these people were elderly, all of them. There were a couple in a barn. The army found them and called me over. And there was a man and a woman. He was lying on top of her, embracing her, as if to protect her. Both had bullet wounds.
The trial chamber knows that some of the killings committed in Uzdol were particularly cruel in nature. The trial chamber knows, in this respect, the killing of Anika Stojanovic, who was half-seated on the ground next to her house when a soldier who was standing 3 meters away from her killed her by a shot to the head. The testimony showed that she cried out the name of her son before she was shot. The trial chamber also notes the direct evidence concerning the manner of killing Ruza Zelic and her two children, who was 13 and 10 years old at the time of their deaths. The three had tried to flee from the soldiers, but the soldiers caught up by them. Ruza Zelic was begging the soldier not to kill them, but all three were shot.
The Chambers had enough evidence to establish facts about crimes committed by Bosnian Muslims and their foreign allies. However, linking the crimes to the accused was not without challenges.
And so the prosecution had to prove, indeed, that these forces were under the effective control of the accused, that the accused had reason to know about the crimes, and that the accused had failed to prevent and punish them. So they were really important cases for the tribunal's jurisprudence on superior responsibility, and we saw a lot of interesting and critical legal issues being worked out in the context of those cases.
In relation to the Mujahideen groups in general, the trial chamber was also not satisfied that these groups had been de facto subordinated to Rasim Delic. It found that the relationship between any groups of foreign Mujahideen and the ABIH at that time was appropriately characterized as cooperation between separate and independent military entities, rather than subordination of the Mujahideen within a single military structure. In conclusion, the trial chamber found that no superior subordinate relationship had existed between Rasim Delic and the perpetrators of the killings in Bikoshi on the 8th of June 1993. Consequently, Rasim Delic does not incur individual criminal responsibility pursuant to Article 7.3 of the statute for the crimes committed in Bikoshi on the 8th of June 1993.
When it comes to the results of the cases, it was a more mixed situation for the Office of the Prosecutor. There were some acquittals and there were some difficult issues that we had to navigate, in large part around issues of effective control. It's a precondition of superior responsibility that the prosecution must prove the accused had the ability to control the conduct of those who committed the crimes. But proving this effective control is not an easy thing, especially when an army might just be in the process of being set up and command structures are not yet fully developed. So that was one barrier or obstacle that we had to navigate in the context of these cases.
Concerning Worcester, the trial chamber has found the crimes was committed by members of the units and the ABH command taking part in the attack on HVO positions in and around Worcester. Having examined all the evidence presented to it, and in light of its factual findings, the trial chamber has found that the prosecution has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Safar Halilovic had effective control over the units and the ABH command, which the trial chamber has found committed crime in Worcester.
With a view to the victims and their relatives, it has to be further emphasized that a decision of acquittal does not necessarily mean that a crime did not occur. It simply means that on the basis of the evidence, the accused cannot be held individually responsible for these crimes.
But overall, the reality is that accountability was established for crimes committed by the Bosnian Muslim armed forces and members of that, and that has been an important precedent for the tribunal.
The Chambers heard that the bloody cycle of Muslim-Croat violence ended in early 1994 with the signing of a peace agreement in Washington, D.C.
And effectively, the agreement reached in February 1994 put an end as effectively a ceasefire to the conflict between Muslims and Croats. in Central Bosnia.
That's what's really heartbreaking about Central Bosnia. I mean, the whole war everywhere in Bosnia and everywhere in the former Yugoslavia was unnecessary and could have been avoided, but nowhere more than Central Bosnia. Because Central Bosnia is not one of these areas which people associated with any kind of national or political radicalism. There were lots of moderates in Central Bosnia. Witnesses on both sides of these cases were very moderate and didn't want to see things come to a conflict. The problem was, and it becomes clear when you look at these cases, the radicals did a very, very good job of outmaneuvering the moderates, both before and in the early stages of the war.
The war in Central Bosnia did not end with the Croat-Muslim agreement. In spring of 1995, the Muslim forces initiated a series of operations against the Serb army in northern part of Central Bosnia. The Serb prisoners were taken to camps operated by the Mujahideen.
These people are committing a disproportionate share of the crimes that are being committed on the Bosnian side. A very disproportionate share, and also some of the most lurid incidents they're involved with.
Kad su svi dovedeni u kuću, jedan od mudžahidina, ne sjećam se ko, donio je Gojkovu glavu zakačenu na mesarsku kuku u obliku slova S. Onako sa vrata idući glavu je bacio, ne sjećam se tačno redoslijeda, da li Krstanu Marinkoviću ili Igoru Guljevate, uglavnom kod njih dvojice je ta glava bila na krilu. I onda nedugo poslije toga, uz sva moguća iživljavanja koja su uz to išla, uzimali su tu glavu i nosili od jednog do drugog zarobljenika govoreći ljubi brata. Kad je prošlo jedno izvjesno vrijeme, tu su na zid sobe na toj kuki okačili glavu, znači da, po njihovim riječima, da i Gojko bude zajedno sa nama.
In relation to the gravity of the crimes, the majority, amongst others, recalled the appallingly brutal nature of the acts of mistreatment against the 12 VRS soldiers, which had lasted more than 1 month, and the physical and mental suffering that the victims had endured while subjected to such abysmal treatment during their detention in Livade and the Kamenica camp.
And, you know, that's when it really dawns on you that, I mean, you have the numbers of victims in the schedule and the indictment, and you've got the figures. But for every figure you've got people with families. And it's only then when you start dealing with the people who were there that it occurs to you that the enormity of what happened, because all of these numbers, that's all people. That's people with families and homes, and you know, you multiply it. It's not just Central Bosnia, it's everywhere. And you get a real sense of the enormity of it.
The tribunal's findings played a key role in prosecution of crimes in Central Bosnia before the Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In addition to Pashko Ljubicic, whose case was forwarded from the tribunal, the Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina prosecuted more than 20 individuals for those crimes.
The evidence that we gathered in those early days, working on the cases involving Central Bosnia, were absolutely necessary in order to gain an understanding of the broader picture, and they led directly to the higher level cases, which were brought here. And every day we go back and look at some of these things over again. And this material and this knowledge will be used over and over again because they're still prosecuting people in the region.
The extensive efforts of the investigators, prosecutors, and judges of the tribunal played a key role in establishing the facts about crimes in Central Bosnia. The tribunal's jurisprudence developed in these cases made a major contribution to the promotion of the rule of law in Bosnia and Herzegovina and beyond.
Well, the biggest achievement is now we know. We know what happened. And if it hadn't been for the ICTY, and all the efforts we put forward and all the support we got from people from the outside, we never would have known these things. We know an awful lot about what happened, and people will never be able to make the sorts of claims they were making 20 years ago about what happened there. And that's not just true for Central Bosnia. That's true for the whole region.
I think what's hopeful from the Central Bosnia cases is really the story of how international justice can ultimately prevail, even if sometimes it takes a long time, too long in the eyes of many people. You have to, I suppose, cast your mind back to what the climate was in those early years when the Central Bosnia cases started, where everybody was sceptical about whether the ICTY could ever even function as an effective institution, whether international justice was really an ideal that could never be achieved in practice. And then you think now about what we've managed to achieve over that time, and it is remarkable, and it has sparked a whole range of events culminating in the ICC that has been really important. And these cases of Central Bosnia, I think, played a really important part of all of that.